So in the last video, in the last series, we were talking about mainly in the Industrial Revolution and how certain inventions really impacted and began to mold our country and the culture in our country in different areas, and began to develop, how different areas began to develop in the culture, and then how they began to have a worldview. And so now we're going to look at, well, now that we see that the country is kind of being culturally divided up into different ways of living, the South agricultural, the North very industrial, we're going to look at what that led to. So when two people start living differently, what does that kind of do to them? In a lot of ways, it breaks them apart. Here's some of the vocabulary we are going to be dealing with as we go through this road to the Civil War. And here's just a review from some of the impact or the consequences that we talked about in the last video. The North had better transportation. The North had most of the industry in the country. The South was mainly agricultural. Slavery was essential for them to agriculturally be successful, as to produce the cotton is a very high intensive labor product. So there, one person in the North is going to a factory, the other person is making their money by having slaves work and pick their commodity. So two very different mindsets. Here again is just a review from the last videos about the Northeast was industrial, the South was cotton and slavery, and the West became the real source for a lot of food production for us. And what does it do? Again, now that the South is agriculture based on cotton, you have a lot of tenant farmers, and these are farmers that are renting land, trying to grow things, trying to make it within the cotton industry, you would say. So they were relatively poor. A lot of them, most of them did not have slaves. You have these huge millionaires after millionaires, these plantations. And slavery was common, it was accepted, it was thought as the norm or normal. And so in the South, because it's agriculture based, it's very different lifestyle with the North. In the North you have railroads and people can go from one place to another and be exposed to other things. There was a telegraph where information would be sent across these telegraph lines, and you could find out very quickly what was happening or what were the news events that happened in another part. They had trade unions. We had a lot of immigrants coming to come work in our factories, and the conditions in the factories were not very good, and so these workers would band together and demand better working conditions, better facilities, safer. And so here, just with the idea of trade unions and saying, well, we have some rights, we need to have a decent wage and decent conditions, and that's very different than the mindset a slave would have, or the owner of a slave would have, that this slave deserves good conditions. And so many of them just never thought like that. To give you an idea of how significant the cotton gin, how it impacted the South, when it was first invented, slaves, you had 750,000 slaves. And they produced just 3,000 bales of cotton. But 10 years later, we went from 750 to 1 million slaves. So another 300,000. But look at how we jump up with the bales of cotton. How effective and efficient the cotton gin was for being able to create and sell bales of hay. And I need you to stop the video at this and really look at this and see how in 1810 and 1820, how it practically doubles and triples, and the amount that's produced. people do not produce a product if they're not going to generate a good profit from it. And so the real push here is to make the money. The cotton gin made slavery very profitable, especially for the cotton kingdom, or the owners of these very large plantations who would have hundreds of slaves that could produce so much cotton. But as this began to grow, there became a resistance to slavery. And that resistance to slavery obviously wouldn't be in the South, because that was part of their culture and how they made their money. The resistance to slavery began with the Northerners. And there were people who began to look at this and say, ethically and morally, this is wrong. This should not be done. And they wanted to abolish or permanently get rid of slavery. So they were called abolitionists, from the word abolish. Here again, here's your cotton production. You can see it on a map. Here's your 45 bales of hay per square mile. So per 1 mile, you got 45 bales of hay. And you can see in South Carolina and Georgia, there was a big area, a lot of cotton growing. Down here by New Orleans, there was a lot of it too. And that's in 1820. Here, 40 years later, you can see the production of cotton is predominant throughout the South. And in North Carolina, you can see it's very predominant, except where we have the mountains. So it has just grown tremendously in 40 years. But what happens in the West? Now, again, with the transportation, with the idea of being able to move goods with the plow, with the reaper, and all the railroads, people are beginning to move west, and they want to establish their own farms and begin to make money. So as people moved west in populated areas, these areas became states. So now we have Michigan territory, and we have Illinois and Indiana, Ohio. And these are states that we call free states. Everything here in green are states that did not have slavery, okay, in the free territories. Now, slave states are here. You have the Arkansas Territory that was open to slavery, but this is not a state yet. So our big dilemma as a country is, as people move out here and states begin to apply for statehood to be a part of the Union, will we allow slavery to leave the South and go and in a sense, invade the rest of the country? So in 1819, there were 11 slave states, and there were 11 free states. Missouri applied for statehood, but if Missouri came in as a slave state, it would upset the balance. So Congress, there was a huge discussion, huge fight. What do we do? The people in the North were like, we need to stop slavery from growing, and it's wrong going through the country. The South said, you know what? Our Constitution says we can choose to live how we want to live, and you better not stop and tell us. So they come up with this compromise, and the compromise is that Missouri will be allowed to become a state in the Union and be a slave state if Maine comes in and as a free state. So the balance, now it's 12 to 12. So no perspective has more power in Congress. And that was a big issue. Who would have the power in Congress? If they got one more state, they would have more pro-slavery votes. So that was the compromise. And the compromise was the bottom border of Missouri, any land the United States has above it would be non-slave area. Any area below it, like Arkansas Territory, would be an area where slavery would be allowed. And we will continue looking at this in the next video.